What's up? I'm AJ and welcome back to Gen Z Garage. In this episode, we're going to be putting the engine and the transmission back onto the subframe, as well as these newly cleaned brackets, various mounts for various purposes, and we will also be installing clutch kit. So let's get started. At the end of my last technical video, I reassembled the motor, painted it, and picked up the transmission from the transmission shop. The transmission was the only part of the car that I paid someone else to refurbish. While I'm sure I could have done it myself, I wanted to make sure it was done properly as it requires a lot of adjustment and with installation tools that I do not personally own. I'll eventually rebuild one myself, but I entrusted this job to AAMCO of Brandon.
AAMCO, AAAMCO.
Quite frankly, they were the only transmission shop that was even willing to look at a manual transmission. Nearly half of the transmission shops I called said they don't rebuild transmissions at all, they just replace them, and the other half didn't have anyone that actually knew how to work on a stick shift. AAMCO didn't hesitate and offered to rebuild my transmission. After disassembling the case, they told me that the transmission was mostly intact, still functional, which I knew, but that it had had significant wear in different areas. During the initial disassembly, they identified broken and missing selector arm bushings, a badly burnt and worn fifth gear, worn bearings overall, and even a broken case where the throwout bearing shafts pivots. So they reached out through their contacts and purchased a known good used transmission from West Coast Parts in California, which specializes in F-body and Fiero parts. They wanted to keep as much from the original transmission as possible, so they kept first through fourth gear and reversed from the original, fifth from the donor transmission, the bell housing from the donor transmission, and the main body from the original transmission. This was a somewhat rare version of the Isuzu 5-speed, which has a built-in fluid dipstick tube, so we wanted to make sure we kept that. They also replaced the synchros with new ones, and even replaced all the bearings and seals. When I got the transmission back, I went ahead and painted it with aluminized silver ceramic base paint to give it that new aluminum case look. I then reattached as many brackets as I could at this point. Of course, with the transmission looking fantastic, I also needed to make sure the engine looked good too. In the previous video, you saw me paint the various covers and brackets. Everything was pressure washed, degreased, scrubbed, sanded, primed, painted, and painted again. I went with Ford engine gray on the block and epoxy chassis black for everything else. I wanted to make sure that the engine looked as original as possible, but the gray engine paint at least allowed me to see any leaks that may occur over time or even after installation. Finally, I even made sure to paint the numbers on the crank timing indicator. Now that I had a fantastic looking engine and transmission, I couldn't just reinstall them on the old worn out subframe. I had to completely restore that too. I finished tearing down the subframe by removing every bracket and every single bolt that I could, taking it down to the bare frame. When I was sure I removed everything, I then got back to task removing the old rubber bushings. There's a few ways you can do this, but I chose to burn them out with a blowtorch. It's a bit messy, but it's the only way to really get the rubber separate from the bushing shells. I ended up going with the black polyurethane cradle bushings, so I needed the shells to be intact. I continued to burn the bushings until I had a nice tire fire going. As the rubber started to fall away, I used a large flathead screwdriver to scrape away the remaining rubber remains in the shell bushing. With the subframe totally stripped, I move it off the driveway to begin degreasing and cleaning. I start by spraying the entire subframe down with engine degreaser. The Iron Duke had over 200,000 miles on it, and by this point had leaked gallons of oil all over it through the decades. In some places, the caked-on oil was up to a half an inch thick. As the degreaser ate away at the oil, I continued to scrub the subframe with a plastic bristled bathroom brush to get off some of the larger chunks of oil. With most of the oil scraped off, I then pressure washed and re-pressure washed the cradle to get every square inch of the subframe grease-free. Although the subframe was in really good shape, there were a couple of areas where the seams had rusted and become a little bit brittle. I chose to re-weld and harden many of these seams, particularly in areas where the factory hadn't completely welded. With the subframe ready to paint, I doused the subframe with a solution of denatured alcohol and additional solvents to remove any grease, wax, or leftover paint. I then sprayed the entire subframe with Loctite's Extend Rust Neutralizer. While you should never use this on heavily rusted metal, it does help chemically convert surface rust to a black primer. I used this everywhere I could to help seal and eliminate any rust I could find. Next, I used several cans of flat red metal etching primer. I specifically used red since it would stand out in stark contrast to everything else on the frame, so I knew if I had complete coverage or if I had missed a spot. Finally, after allowing each of these steps to dry for 30 minutes or more, I applied 2 coats of semi-gloss epoxy chassis black paint throughout. Once everything was dry and ready to go, I placed the cradle on a wooden dolly my dad made for me. We strapped down one side with a ratchet strap and left the other side loose. It was designed tall enough that it could slide over an engine hoist. I installed a set of new motor and transmission mounts onto the subframe, which I'd purchased from the Fiero store. This consists of the single engine motor mount and the 2 lateral transmission mounts. With the cradle ready to go, I now needed to get the motor off the engine stand so I could install the clutch, and eventually made it to the transmission. I chose to use the 2 opposing factory I-hook brackets already attached to the motor, but first, I covered my nicely painted valve cover with shop rags to prevent them from getting scratched. I used locking grab hooks attached to a strong chain to lift and suspend the motor, and then remove the bolts holding it to the engine stand. Before I can put the engine on the cradle, I have to first mate it to the transmission, which means I need to install the clutch kit. I lower the engine while on the hoist and use brake cleaner on a shop rag to clean it off the flywheel mating surface. With the flywheel clean, I then install the clutch disc. I carefully remove it from the packaging while ensuring that I do not touch it with my bare hands. As this is a mostly unmodified motor, I went with a standard but high quality replacement clutch kit from Rock Auto by M-PACT, which meets or exceeds OEM specifications. I used a supplied centering pin to ensure it's centered and then push it flat against the flywheel. Next, I installed a pressure plate. I hand tighten the supplied plate to the flywheel bolts and then use an impact gun to torque them down. Before we can mate the engine and transmission, we need to also do some work to the transmission. I use the supplied high temp grease to lubricate the throwout bearing surface and fork arm contact points. You can put grease on the input shaft, but it is generally not necessary. I then install the throwout bearing. Next, I move back to the engine as I install the freshly painted lower motor mount and alternator brackets. With these installed, I can finally join the engine and transmission. Typically, you would do this with a transmission support or another engine hoist, but my dad held the engine in place for me while I hand threaded the bell housing bolts. The transmission weighs about 90 pounds drained, so doing it this way is not an unreasonable option. With the top 2 bolts threaded in, I then cinch them down with my M-PACT gun. With all the other bolts installed, I then install the transmission mounting brackets, which are both needed for me to properly place the engine and transmission combination on the subframe. Finally, I install the flywheel cover plate at the bottom of the engine, since this will be much harder to install once everything else is installed on the subframe. The engine and transmission are now complete and I'm ready to install it onto the subframe and dolly. I pull the engine hoist out onto the driveway and then wheel the subframe over the legs of the engine hoist and put it carefully into position below the engine and transmission combination. Once again, while I should be using 2 engine hoists, my dad decides to lift the engine cradle and dolly up to the engine directly while I attach the mounting bolts. No doubt my grandmother, his mother, will be watching this and scold him for not using the proper tools and risking a hurt back. With the engine and transmission now bolted into the cradle, I slowly lower the engine cradle onto the ground and onto all 4 wheels. and then roll it out from under the hoist.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and make sure to enable notifications so you can see the next video I posted. I am super duper proud of this. It's like my throne right now. I'm just chilling. There was blood, sweat, and tears. I hit my head on the subframe, but this turned out very well, and I'm very proud. So thank you again for watching. Thrown on wheels. Wait, are the wheels locked?
No, it's just very heavy.
Ah. It just takes more energy. Newton's.
Is that your
Is
new
that
couch?
the third law? No, that's the second law.
Is that your new couch?
It's my Gen Z garage throne.
Okay. Will that be in our living room now?
No, probably more in the garage because I don't
Okay.
think we're gonna be able to get it up the stairs.
It's like a little mini go-kart.